Thank you for joining me on this latest episode of the MindHack podcast. I'm your host, Cody McLean, and I have a special guest. His name is Seth Braverman. Hear from you from a company called Xylem Design. Welcome to the show, Seth.
Thanks.
So I wanted to start just by introducing how we met. I'm wondering if you're able to recall the day, the event.
I actually remember looking across the shop. We had a bunch of folks in there, about 64 people from all over the world, really. We had Australia, a few Europeans, some Canadians, and of course, a bunch of us Americans. And it was at our wood shop in Fort Collins, Colorado for a lean summit. It was the annual year of the summit. We're now into the 6th year, I think. But it was the first year it had moved around. And I remember looking across the shop and looking down, and I'm like, man, that guy's got some nice looking shoes. I wonder who that guy is. So that's kind of the beginning of it. I don't remember a whole lot from that, the tour itself. Maybe, you could kind of highlight from your perspective exactly what was going on there or why you came.
Well, I was invited, I think, just you sent me a LinkedIn message, and in my head, I was just like, why not myself? And so you invited me to speak at this Lean Summit. And I think that the basis of this Lean Summit that I think your company has been sponsoring for the past 6 years has been surrounding this Kaizen philosophy, right?
Yeah. So continuous improvement basically would be, if we had to boil it down to one thing, what brings everybody together. Everybody there, we're all leaders of their own companies and coming to learn from each other and see kind of what we're all about. And the structure of each of these meetings as it moves around the globe is basically, let's go to one facility where they've been pursuing continuous improvement or Kaizen or lean manufacturing based on the Toyota production system. Let's see how they've applied it. And then let's spend a couple of days connecting and talking to each other about what is and isn't working for us and learn from each other. And so that first day was simply just touring our factory and seeing what we have going on. And then the next day and a half, I think, is where a handful of people, including yourself, were able to share.
And can you tell me exactly what Xylem Designs does, and also what led to you guys creating this Lean Summit in the first place?
Yeah, so we are a display manufacturer. We've been around for about 30 years. We started building display easels. And about 10 or 11 years ago, we started getting calls from customers asking if we build displays for 3D art. And so we developed what we think is a fairly innovative approach to a commodity, which is a pedestal, a 5-sided box. And we built a website, and that grew. And then we started having businesses and, Victoria's Secret and UGG, different companies coming to us saying, hey, can you help us with this launch or with this event, with this trade show? And slowly just learning what their pain points were and what their needs were, we developed a standard product line. So what we do is we build displays and engineer from design to build for trade shows, events, and a lot of art collectors as well. So we're basically a custom fab shop. We have about 30 employees, 20 folks working on the floor. And it was about 7 years ago that the owner of the company, Greg Glebe, just knew that something was missing, knew he wanted to get some more direction and really focus the operation. And he had a few friends that were starting to pursue this lean manufacturing thing. That was kind of the beginning of it. And since then, it's been a pretty radical transformation for the company in terms of course, profitability, but really more importantly, just the culture. And so, it started ultimately as really what's the best way to do business. And it still is an engaging and exciting and innovating way to approach the business of building.
And I remember, what was his name again? His name is Glenn.
Glenn Bostock was the owner of our company, Greg Glebe, Glenn Bostock of SnapCab. They grew up together, and they were both poor woodworkers together for years, living off of ramen, as they would put it. And he was the first one to discover this Kaizen thing based on the Toyota production system. And so he was kind of harping in Greg's ear for a couple of years before Greg came across Paul Akers, who wrote a book called 2 Second Lean, which basically took a very complex and sometimes scientific approach to building and made it very human. Once he got that distillate from Akers is when it really clicked for him, and he was able to actually apply it in his own operation.
Hmm. And I definitely want to get into Kaizen in a little bit. There's one thing I remember at that conference is I think it was Greg or somebody else who was saying how when you guys actually implemented the Kaizen system that you had to fire a whole bunch of employees. I'm wondering if you kind of what were the circumstances surrounding that?
Yeah, I mean, this really brings in the this idea, which you're well familiar with, of the growth versus static mindset. And so the most important piece of any company, of course, is the people, and everything else kind of flows from there. And the idea is that culture will eat ideology for breakfast, and the culture is what naturally happens throughout the day based on that group of people being together. So when the owner of a company comes in and says, okay, guys, we're going to do everything differently. We've all been asleep, but now we're going to wake up and we're going to be a part of this new thing where every single day, everybody is expected to continuously improve the process of building pedestals. And so you're naturally going to have a certain percentage of the people that want nothing to do with that. And I think if an owner does it well, they're going to come in and say, hey, as clearly as possible, this is what we're moving toward, and this is what the expectation is going to be. And if that's not you, that's totally fine if that's not what you want from a company. But this is what we're going to do, and we're not going to stop doing it. And so naturally, and it's really been a 5 or 6 year process. And using the word weeding out is a little derogatory, but that is kind of what I want to use, is the word weeding out, or the phrase. And some people naturally weed themselves out because, like I said, they know that the expectation, the bar is a little higher. And then other times it's just a matter of trying to coach people, but you can only coach people so far. And if all you're doing is coaching them and you're never actually managing them, then you kind of have to sit down and say, can we just agree that you're miserable here and that you should probably move on? Mm-hmm. And so, there wasn't necessarily any outright firing across the board, but the story you hear over and over from a lot of these companies that decide to adopt a lean production system is that there's just a bunch of people in the company that don't have a growth mindset and very simply just aren't going to stick around, whether it's of their own choice or the choice of the management.
Right. So the growth versus the fixed mindset, which is from the book Mindset by Carol Dweck, originally coined that term, is you can have somebody who either believes that their skills are not limited and that they can learn and that they can grow outside of the existing bubble of knowledge they already have, or that you have the opposite view of somebody who believes that we're born with fixed traits and that we can't grow and get outside of that bubble. And so I guess that would be a challenge whenever you're trying to implement a system that requires employees to actually be a part of the system, to actually improve the system. I know that's a problem that we still continuously have at my company, Support Ninja. And it's difficult to even try and figure out whether they have a growth versus a fixed mindset in the recruitment phase. But when you transitioned to a culture that embodied Kaizen, that embodied this growth mindset, what were the factors, if you can think of any, that differentiated those employees, or any stories?
Yeah, I mean, Kaizen, it has a couple of different translations. One of them I like is continuous improvement by everybody, every day, everywhere. So everybody in the entire company is expected to not only work within the company, but on the company. And we give everybody the first half an hour of the day to work on some improvement. And really, one of the phrases we throw around is fix what bugs you. So if there's ever something that is bugging you, if there's ever frustration, anything that is keeping you from achieving flow, there's probably some waste involved. And so when we say continuous improvement, what we mean in particular is that we were hired by the customer to deliver something of value. Anything that adds cost without adding value is considered waste. So we're trying to train the entire team to learn how to see. And part of it is developing a literacy around the production floor. So there is language that we bring into it. Toyota talks about the 8 wastes and other Japanese terms inevitably that get thrown in there. And that really develops a literacy and a common language so that we can learn to read the shop and learn to read the processes and identify areas where we're adding cost without adding value and then eliminating that. So within the world of our operation, the absolute is the customer. Whatever they value is what we're trying to orient our operation around. And anything they don't value, we're trying to get rid of. And that orientation is I think what Toyota means when they say that respect is one of the foundations of everything they do. Respect for not only the people that they're building the cars for, but also the people building the cars. For anybody to waste their time doing busy work or doing something that somebody is not willing to pay for is disrespectful for the workers, because they're spending more than half their lives in our shop building the things that we are trying to sell, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so when it comes to differentiating what is a value add versus what can you take away from the cost. So if we're looking at like paying for employees' lunches, that is not a cost directly associated with the value that you're offering to the customers. But there's an indirect, perhaps an indirect happiness that the employees are able to perceive out of getting free lunch every day. And so how do you determine what is something that you should cut or is a waste versus what isn't?
Sure. So the first piece of it, just in terms of the actual building of the pedestals, the way we think of it is, if we were to itemize every single cost to build this pedestal, would the customer feel okay about each of those? Obviously, some of the line items would take a little bit more conversation than others. But if one of those line items is 10 minutes in labor to find the tools, we're spending 10 minutes in labor a day to find my tape measure. That's insane. The customer would have nothing to do with that. Why are they spending $7? Why are they covering our dysfunction? So that's one piece of it. The other piece is this idea of price, quality, service, pick any two. And for us, it really is quality and service. And obviously we want to be competitive price-wise, but that service piece, we really are a service-oriented company, service-oriented culture. And part of what that means, as you were identifying, was that we need to make sure that the quality of life for the workers on the floor is high, that they are happy, that they're enjoying their jobs. And that really does get passed on to the customers. One of the things we do is that with every single order, whether it was your grandmother ordering pedestal for her vase in Florida, which we do all the time, or if it's, say, Sony ordering a bunch of stuff for their CES booth, every single order gets a video made by the guys on the floor, and that acts as both a quality control where we verify whatever the paperwork says is what was actually built. And also it's just a way to connect with the customer, show them the shop, and ask them for photos of whatever it is that we're sending them. And that energy definitely translates through. And we get emails and letters back every week from people saying, "Oh, that totally blew me away. I wasn't expecting that. That was so awesome." And some, I think 20% of our orders are taken over the internet, over our website. The other 80%, people work directly with us for custom needs. And so people are just, imagine going and ordering online. It's like, oh, made in America, whatever. And then actually getting a video the day that it's shipping out from the guys that actually built it, verifying that what you ordered is what you're getting. And we've had people say, "You've restored my faith in humanity," which is a little extreme, but that's people actually writing. I mean, we had Bose, one of the project managers at Bose, a couple of months ago, and he sent the video to his entire team saying, "This is how you take care of people. This is how you take care of your customers." And so that for us means a lot. So if our people are happy, and obviously they're in front of the camera every day, then that means that the customer is going to be happy. And that qualitative humanistic side is a big part of the whole thing.
Yeah, happy employees equals happy customers.
Yeah, it's not a joke. And the other side of it is, we are here to serve our customers, but also as leaders of an organization, we are creating opportunity for the 30 people working within our company. And we want to make sure their quality of life is as high as possible. So that's something we're willing to put money into. And not all of that gets passed on to the customer. Not all of that, is necessarily considered overhead. That's not getting cut out of the gross. That might be hitting the bottom line. So we're not necessarily passing all of that along to the customer. That's a burden that we take on as the leadership of the company, because that's the kind of world that we want to live in. So a little bit of the golden rule thing there.
Yeah. And even just circling back to a point that you made earlier about the first half an hour in the day that you allow them to work on anything that you want. I don't know if there's any restrictions around that, but that reminded me of the Google rule. I forgot the exact amount of time that they get every year or every week. Mm-hmm. And Google offers their employees a bunch of free time, and a lot of their projects, such as Gmail, Google Plus, which is now defunct, were actually ideas created in that initial free time. And wondering what kind of ideas or what kind of value adds your employees have been able to make in those first 30 minutes of the day.
Yeah. So going back to kind of this literacy around the production and looking to Toyota, they identified what they call the 8 wastes of manufacturing, 8 process wastes. And there are things like transportation, inventory, overproduction, human motion. A lot of these obvious, some of them not so obvious. The 8th waste they call unused employee genius. And part of that is whenever the employee is working on something that is wasteful, they're not working on something that is value added. The other piece of that is not inviting them to use their creativity and their imagination to solve problems that we may not even be aware of. And the reality is that the people on the floor, they call it the gemba, where the value is added. It's a Japanese word, gemba. Wikipedia tells me anyway. If you're watching news in Japan and they say, we're at the gemba, it kind of means we're at the scene of the crime. So where the actual value is being added, the thing that the customer is willing to pay for, this is where the magic is actually happening. This is where the panel is getting cut and glued and finished. And so the people at the gemba are the ones that really know what the opportunities for improvement are. It's not the managers and the people in the office and so on that really have developed an acute awareness and appreciation for what needs to be improved. So giving them that space every day is that really is where the most brilliant improvement ideas come from. And they're not always necessarily at a strategic level or a shop-wide level. And there are other layers to it, of course. But part of the idea with 2-second lean is that everybody is trying to shave 2 seconds off of a process every day. And that could be something as simple as moving where the drill is. The drill used to be up here, but I realize I'm reaching all the way up there every 10 minutes. If I put the drill right here, then I'm only moving a foot versus 4 feet. And it's something,
a sense of ownership over that process.
Yeah, sense of ownership, which is good and bad, of course. There's always unforeseen consequences. So if somebody stays in one area too long, they become siloed. So part of the way we combat that is we put a premium on cross-training. So we move people around as often as possible. And that also keeps it super collaborative because we have the guy that had mastered that area, moved on to a different area. And the guy that's green behind the ears or gal in that area is now referencing and discussing and talking with the person that had mastered that area about improvement ideas. So there's definitely a balance.
I know that they've done studies in showing how, say, if you become a photographer and then you're also a programmer, these are two completely unrelated fields, but getting expertise in different fields, no matter how far away they actually may seem, can give you perspective on how to actually do your core job or your hobby or your passion better. And it gives you a unique perspective versus if you're just like example I use is if you're just a developer and that's all but say you also do a little bit of design. So UX, the other side of that job so that when you do the development, how they're going to process your code and display it for the customer. It gives you a better understanding how that works. It allows you to be more creative. And at the end of the day, I think probably enjoy your job better, but also produce better work.
Absolutely. And so we were talking with this guy, Norman Bodek, and he, very old fellow at this point, I think he's late 80s, but he was the one that translated a lot of these Japanese texts into the English maybe 30 years ago. And because of that, a lot of the lean stuff started matriculating over. And he has become somewhat of a friend to the owner of our company. And I was in on a call with him a few months ago, and he was talking about, I don't remember if it was Honda, but one of these major auto manufacturers, what they're starting to do is instead of a worker being static on the line and the line flows past them and whatever part of the process that they've been trained on they do, like putting the wheels on or the hood on, they actually are on a moving platform that moves with the car, and they build the car from beginning to end. So the materials are what they flow past. The materials are static, but they and the car move with it. And their whole focus was trying to improve the quality of life for the worker by giving them a diversity of training. So that even goes above and beyond just simply whatever the gains may be in terms of systems awareness. And that's definitely a decision made by the management there to improve the quality of life of the workers. I don't know in terms of productivity what the gains were, but that's pretty cool. That's encouraging to me.
Yeah, I think, if you go to any employer and they say that, not everybody fully embodies the Kaizen philosophy, it means a lot and it can mean different things to different people. But I think a part of it is a sense of ownership, a sense of responsible ethics. And when you're actually the management, where you're not always just focused on what's your bottom line, but you're focused on your employee happiness, your employees meeting their purpose even. And that goes, I think, at a spiritual, at a very deep level that a lot of us don't necessarily get from our jobs. So I would hope that most companies who embody Kaizen to some degree have happier employees.
Yeah, if not, then they're not doing it right. And that speaks to kind of the other piece, really what supports or undergirds this whole continuous improvement project for us is based on, Patrick Lencioni's book, The Advantage, this idea of organizational health, that a company of people that get along together and trust each other are going to outperform a company of people that might be smarter. They might have smarter people within the company, but that are dysfunctional and don't get along together. And a lot of that just comes around clarifying exactly what we're about and exactly what our values are, and then leading from those values and making decisions based on them every day. So that is the work that's been happening in tandem with this continuous improvement piece. So you have the actual production side, but then you have the people piece. And without that focus on the people, none of the other stuff really works. Nobody's going to buy in. Nobody's going to really care. I couldn't overemphasize how important that piece is. So you don't just get to apply the tools of the Toyota production system if you're not actually actively working on the culture and the people and developing your people and getting real clear about what the vision is. And especially for us, because we have and have attracted a lot of millennials. Almost everybody on the floor, I think, is a millennial, save for maybe two of the workers. And part of what I think they love about it is this deep sense of purpose and how they see their own values in life aligning with the values of the company, and they're able to engage with that. So it's that personal, and it was like for our parents, for the boomers, they were just all about work, and personal life was completely separate and almost subjugated. And then for the Gen Xers, they wanted a balance. They wanted equal parts work and personal. And I think for some of these younger generations, they want this blend. They want the two to inform and influence each other. And they want some fluency of personal and business. Those lines aren't quite as clearly defined anymore. That's been good for us.
There has been in recent months, I think it's spawned by an article on BuzzFeed, and it was talking about millennial burnout. And I personally just related to that article so much about my own feelings of feeling burnt out consistently and feeling a lot of the stuff that I do isn't deeply connected with a sense of why. There is another article, I think 2 weeks ago, that was actually about this discussion about what Gary Vaynerchuk is all about, the hustle culture. And you go to any WeWork office and they have these signs saying like, I'm not going to sleep, I'm going to hustle all night. And it's just about the sense of like, I've got to work. And whereas before, maybe 10 years ago, you walk into an office, you tell somebody, oh, I only got 5 hours of sleep. And, it was something that you boasted about. But now as I think articles and science has caught on, it's no longer something you boast about, but in a sense, it's still something where millennials are actually boasting about them hustling, even if it's not 40 hours a week for a company. But if you're a startup, then I think it's acceptable to do that. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that. Like, do you guys limit the time that your employees can work? Do they ever ask for overtime? Do you have any idea about this connection between hustle culture and what millennials should be working, or what their view is?
I mean, part of it, especially from a management perspective, is feed the hungry. So if somebody's coming to us hungry, we're going to feed them, whatever that looks like. The other thing for us in particular is that because we're a manufacturing facility, there's safety, and safety is always first. And of course, there's the piece of it where emotional safety, but the other part of it, of course, is physical safety. So working more than 10 hours is a bad idea if you're working around table saws and chop saws and all that. And the other piece of it as well for us is that if we're a systems-oriented operation, Toyota says that the system is the solution, then there shouldn't be any heroes. And there shouldn't be that much opportunity for heroes. The system itself should be taking care of the customer and taking care of the employees. And part of what's different, I think, for us is because we're not necessarily a tech company, we're not going to find some sort of 10x. For us, 10 to 15% growth year over year is sustainable and is in line with our vision. And it allows us to take care of our customers and take care of our employees without burning one group or dropping the ball on the other. So it is definitely is different in that regard. But it does come down to feed the hungry. We started a book group about 7 months ago, and it initially was for the leaders in the company, but it was open to anybody. And it's been really interesting to see who ends up coming to this. It's every Wednesday. We buy free pizza. We buy the books. They have to read it on their own time, and it's off the clock when we all meet. And we have about 8 to a dozen of the employees will show up for this. The last book we read was The 7 Habits, which is a really long book, brutally long. But we've done things like extreme ownership. We did The Obstacle is the Way. Crucial Conversations, one of the best books you could give one of your employees. Highly recommend.
That's the story, right? We're in the boardroom and a consultant comes in and then you have all the different characters.
So he traditionally does that type of a book, but this one actually is just him writing about oh, no, it's actually a group. Sorry, I'm thinking of Lencioni. No, Crucial Conversations is really this idea that the quality of your life is determined by what they call crucial conversations. And they're conversations where there's one of 3 things. One of them is that it's high stakes. Another one is that people disagree with each other. And the third one is that it's emotionally charged, naturally. And their thesis is simply that you can improve the quality of those conversations by training. And they walk through a list of tools for how to have better crucial conversations. And I don't know if any book has had more of a more dramatic influence on the company than that one in the last 3 years. Our lead engineer, he's late 50s, definitely an engineer, love the hell out of the guy. He said something to the effect of, I wish I would have read this book in my 20s. Because it improved his EQ. It improved his ability to have conversations with people where there are emotions. So anyways, that's been one of the areas that we've opened up for people that are hungry to come and feed on great conversation. And it's not exactly answering your answer, but
no, it's totally fine.
That's been an important piece of creating opportunity for people to grow. Because once again, we're a manufacturing operation. You look at the bottom line of most manufacturing facilities, it's not the same as the bottom line for a SaaS operation. And so the opportunities for growth, yes, there are financial, but a lot of them really are personal, intellectual, emotional, relational. And that's a lot of what we focus on.
I wanted to ask you about growth, but I also just wanted to touch that the book that I was describing, it's called The 5 Dysfunctions of...
Oh, yes. Yep. And that's a Lencioni, I think, right?
Yes. That was a great book as well. And I think it's an interesting variation of a business book because it actually details a fictional story of a consultant coming in. And the part that I remember the most is how the CEO or the founder actually is sitting there on his laptop, not paying attention to the whole meeting. And then the consultant forces him to put the laptop away. And that is so me.
Yeah.
I do much and I feel I know I shouldn't, but nobody else has the heart to always speak up. But
sure.
Something that I'm trying to improve upon on myself is especially those interpersonal skills and how can I come across to my employees without them feeling so threatened because I'm the founder of the company.
Yeah, any opportunity to practice presence, and whenever you're having to lead a meeting or be a part of a meeting, it's a great opportunity.
What does that look like to you, presence?
Part of it, so I think you say presence, I think of mindfulness. Mm-hmm. I went to a poetry reading with one of our employees. He got his MFA, his Master's of Fine Arts at RISD, which is apparently one of the most prestigious art schools in the country. He studied sculpture and poetry, and he's in our acrylics department. He's been with us for about 18 months. He's become a dear friend of mine. We went to a poetry reading in town at CSU, Colorado State University. And afterwards, we were having a similar discussion about mindfulness and presence. And we were walking out to the car and it was snowing and it was just beautiful out. And I said, Jeff, we are in the parking lot of CSU and it is January 27th, 2019, and it's 13 degrees out and it's snowing and it's gorgeous and we'll never be here again. Can we just appreciate this moment? Which is to say, I suppose, the ability to call each other into presence. And simply the idea that that's really all we get. And that's where the magic happens is now. It's not some plan we're making in the future, not that we shouldn't plan. And it's not something that happened in the past, not that we shouldn't have gratitude for what's happened. But it's really about being able to be as in the moment as possible. People have been throwing around the phrase real time. I've been making fun of it lately. what does real time actually mean as opposed to fake time? Which I guess the internet gives us fake time, which is why we need the phrase real time, unfortunately. But it's a collaborative effort, I think. And if you're, as a leader, if you're able to call people into presence, for example, we had an operations meeting this morning, which I lead, and one of the sales reps was getting all flustered talking about this problem we have with shipping stuff to Canada. And being able to kind of calm her down and bring her back in the room and affirm that it's great she cares about this problem and that we will get it solved was a powerful movement in actually moving us towards some progress instead of everybody just getting pissed off at each other.
How did you recognize that? Was she showing signs of anxiety, or was somebody else getting heated? And how did you handle that? Like, did you get her out of the room and then have a conversation with her? What did that look like?
Yeah, so she was obviously getting flustered, and I myself was getting annoyed. Actually, that's how I knew initially was that I was getting annoyed. And that's part of the problem. You got to deal with your own shit, and then you got to like stop and reset, and then you got to find a way to lead the person back into the room. We didn't go out of the room. We just kind of dealt with it in real time. Part of it was just affirming her concern and then putting in more clear terms what the problem was more clearly than she was able to. Because ideally in these meetings, what we're doing is we're identifying, discussing, and solving problems. That's based on the EOS model. They call it IDS, the Entrepreneurial Operating System.
That's a great system, by the way, that my company adopted. And
really?
It's not something we fully adopted word by word. And I think that there's like this unknown thing that they don't tell you about the EO system is that it is an organization that they are trying to sell you to have their consultants charge you 10
Sure.
Buy that thing. You read the book and you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. But then you try to apply it and it's nearly impossible if you already have a functioning business with people already within their roles. And so there is a value to it, don't get me wrong. But I didn't realize that going into it.
Yeah, and that's always mixed. It's like, is the message pure? I don't know. The reality is every business has an operating system, whether they're aware of it or not. And whatever you need to wake yourself up to, whatever your operating system is, as shitty as it may be, is worth the wake-up call. So you can start working on it then, right?
Yeah, it was definitely helpful for us that the biggest thing is giving us the structure for the weekly leadership meetings that we have. And then also being able to identify a problem that somebody brings up, because before somebody would bring up a problem and then we would spend the entire rest of the meeting talking about that problem, right? And people are sitting on the line, it's like not relevant to them. And now we add it to the IDS list, which is the identify, decide, solve. And so relevant people will then have a conversation at some later point to actually discuss that problem, but we don't spend the entire thing talking about it.
And for us, just evolutionarily as an operation, what's funny is as much as you try and break out of it, you're still subject to groupthink. And so we're all part of this same dysfunctional system called Xylem design, and we're all trying to evolve together. And one of our current states of dysfunction is that we move right into solving it before we've really done a root cause analysis. You know, the Toyota calls it the 5 whys. Ask why 5 times. Peel back the layers, get to the real root of the problem. Once you've clearly identified the problem, I think it's a Steve Jobs quote, if you can clearly identify the problem, you've already gotten 90% or 80% of the solution. But we gloss over that. And even this morning, that was part of what I was trying to bring us back to. So what's the problem? So what's the problem? So what exactly is the problem? And even as a leader, I sense or I feel that we are wasting time and we are not having a productive conversation, but I don't know what I need to do to rein us in. And obviously I could just say, okay, guys, let's sidebar this and talk about it later. But that might make people feel disenfranchised and it won't obviously solve the problem. So I was trying to remain a little more present, bringing it back to the idea of presence, and invite her into a different kind of conversation by engaging her in a way that I haven't engaged her, because we have about 8 people in this meeting. And there's one person in particular, this woman, that tends to open up the conversation a little longer than might be productive. So I challenge myself to rein her in a sensitive way, and also not just dismiss it, but try and affirm that there is a problem here, try and clarify what the root of the problem is as far as I see it, and then move the conversation towards that clarity.
Yeah, it can be easy to get stuck on a problem, especially as a sole employee, but to offer them a support from an emotional sense, as well as the rational, okay, this is how we're going to solve it. I think is important, but also as an employer to make sure that you're offering that emotional support. Sometimes you have to offer that prior to talking about the actual problem at hand so that they can have their feelings settle and we can then have a rational conversation about it.
Yeah, people want to know how much you care before they care how much you know. And that comes partly out of reading one of the 7 habits, which is seek first to understand. So I've been trying to apply that in particular. And that's actually freed me up because it gives me an objective way to approach something that is highly subjective. It gives me a way of almost resetting and doing kind of a stoic reset, and then approaching them and saying, okay, on one side, you're really annoying the hell out of me right now, but on the other side, you obviously care about this issue and there is an issue here. And so I'm going to try and first understand what the issue is before I respond to my frustration with how it's being dealt with.
Yeah, that reminded me of, I was watching this Netflix show called Brain Games. Fantastic show. The guy is on there. I forgot his name, but he's a very smart person who became popular on YouTube by having these flow moments where he would just talk about the universe or science. An amazing kind of flow that he has. But in one of the episodes, he was actually talking about the differences between male and female brains. And there was a contest where actually he had all these lists of instructions, and then you had a couple, a male and a female, actually try and follow the instructions. And the male would always read from the top, bottom, where he'd have to dance like a chicken. He'd have to say his part. He'd have to go around in circles on the floor. And most of the time, the woman actually read the entire list of instructions. And at the very bottom, it said, all you have to do is sign your name and you don't have to do any of the other steps, and you have completed all the instructions. So that women tend to read all the instructions before they even start the actual process itself. And so the winner is by default most of the time. And I found that quite interesting.
Yeah, and whatever the difference is, man, woman, whatever that the distinction may be, realizing that, okay, we have a system, we have an operation, we have an ideal of what we're trying to achieve and how we think we're achieving it. But at the end of the day, it's just a bunch of people trying to figure their shit out and trying to become better. And you can't get around the human aspect of it. So that requires a good dose of humility and patience with yourself, first and foremost.
Yes. I remember when I was a kid and I looked up at all adults and I thought, wow, they're so smart. They all know what they're doing. And you have to become an adult and you realize nobody has any idea what the hell they're doing either. So it's an interesting way of perceiving the world, knowing that honestly, even the most successful people really don't know what the hell they're doing. Everybody in some sense is faking it. And they have to have some level of blind confidence in themselves, because that's how you become successful. That's how you get out under the bottom swells where maybe you're not too good or something tragic happens to you. You just have to keep distracting yourself with something new.
Well, and for me, ultimately, it comes down to whether it's a belief in the self, I think just a belief in life. Life is so beautiful. And if it can't sustain growth in this area, or if it can't sustain this narrative, then really what is it? And so for me, it really is coming back time and again, not so much to putting myself on the line, but it sounds a little lofty, but kind of putting existence as a human on the line. What is possible? How far can we take this? And realizing that life is both short and long, and pushing on both of those ends of the spectrum and trying to figure out what the next step should be.
Earlier, after you were mentioning poetry, there was a quote that I remember dicing it a little bit, that Confucius said that if you're living in the past, you're depressed. And if you're living in the future, you're anxious.
Mm-hmm.
So,
exactly. Yeah. Yep. I was thinking of that same quote, actually.
So I want to switch gears a bit and actually talk about your interest in poetry, which is something that you've had for a long time now. Wondering if you can tell me where you garnered this interest and basically what it means to you.
Yeah, I still don't really know what poetry is ontologically as a thing in the world. I still am asking what is a poem, but the interest has been there for years and years and years. It's only in the last 3 years that there's been this intensified focus on writing poetry and poetry as a pursuit to certain ends. But it's always been around. It's always been a thing. It would almost be for years, probably since one of my first memories is 2004 when I was living in Hawaii. I remember reading Dante's Inferno. and just feeling in flow, feeling like I was just in flow with the universe or whatever that was, just this sense where, I lost time. And I've never been a big hobbies guy. I was never an athlete. So for me to find that flow, it took a little longer, and to develop kind of an understanding or an internal literacy of flow. And so it was a few years ago when I started looking back on, well, I had such limited resources, so busy at work, so busy at home. I have a little girl, a family, and asking myself, okay, with my limited resources, what do I fill myself with? And I thought, well, what's the most sustainable resource on the planet? And at the time, the thought was, I think it's joy, as opposed to say happiness or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I was like, okay, what brings me joy? And one of the things that brings me joy was poetry. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to try and do that every single day. So I started waking up an hour early, which at the time for me was 4:30, and read poetry, and then started writing it. And that was my way of kind of refilling my source. Now, in terms of why exactly, that's a little different, but that's how I came to what I would call a love of poetry.
Would you say you had a lack of meaning or purpose in other parts of your life that caused you to start waking up an hour earlier to start pursuing this?
I wouldn't say so much a lack, so much as simply not having a vernacular or a form. Like there was a substance, but there wasn't necessarily a form or a medium. And so something like poetry gave me a medium through which to start working out and exercising and understanding some of these things. And it could be any number of things. It could be painting, it could be counseling, it could be running, whatever that form is. I needed something to give body to some of these emotions and experiences. And it's been very fruitful ever since.
Can you give me some examples of poems either that you've read or you've wrote and what they mean to you?
That's a good question. In terms of particular, so I grew up in kind of a, I guess you could call it evangelical world, and there was a lot of ways of approaching life and approaching yourself, and a lot of which has been deconstructed and kind of thrown off. But some of the ideas are still there, like this idea of a prayer or a meditation. And there's a poem by Osip Mandelstam called "And I Was Alive," as translated by Christian Wyman. And that was the first poem I ever memorized. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. And I memorized it and took it into myself. And whenever I was stressed, whenever I needed to call myself into presence and to reinvigorate a sense of gratitude, which for me is always kind of the starting point, just stop and acknowledge that you are alive, and it is good to be alive, and it is weird and wonderful to be alive. And this poem and the recitation of it was a way for me to call myself back into that presence and really ground myself at the very core of my ethic, which would then inform anything, whether it was talking to my parents, talking to a business associate, talking to a friend, making a difficult decision. This was always the best and strongest place for me to move out from. So that is an example of a poem that was allowing me to do a meaningful work in the world.
Mm. Yeah, that's very powerful. I know it's talked about in Stoicism about having a way to take yourself out of the situation, about when you have either anger or your emotionally charged feelings, how you can separate from that. There was actually one interesting thing. I sponsored a Kickstarter project a while ago, and it's called The Thinking Egg. And despite it being consumerism, you can buy a very small eggs made out of different materials. And so I bought this egg that was made out of lava rock. And so I don't carry it with me anywhere, but I've done a few minutes of trying to associate those feelings of gratitude, of love, of serenity. And sometimes I'll put it into my egg when I know I'm going to be anxious somewhere. And just whenever I put my hand in my pocket, if I'm reaching for my wallet or my phone or just out of comfort and I feel that egg, it's this reminder about that serenity, that happiness, that feeling. And I'm able to try and pull myself back if I'm in a bad situation.
Yeah, it's almost a totem. It's something, it's some little feature that catches the light that reminds you of the beauty of the world, right? Mm-hmm. It's a short poem. I'd be glad to read it. Not that you'd have to use it, but you might appreciate it. There's actually probably a better reading than this online that comes from the actual translator, Christian Wyman, who's a poet I'd highly recommend looking for. He was the editor of Poetry Magazine, which is, I don't know if you'd call it the most prestigious publication in the poetry world. I don't really know the poetry world that well, and I don't particularly care for it. And the deeper I get into it, the less I love poetry. So I'm trying to find a balance there. But he was a particularly gifted, or is a particularly gifted editor and poet. And so he teaches, I think, at is it Princeton or Yale, maybe Yale now. Anyway, this is a translation by him of Osip Mandelstam, famous Russian poet. As Krishna Wyman says, this poem was written within the last year of Mandelstam's life. He was on the run from Stalin for the last 4 years of his life. He had written a poem about Stalin that was very unbecoming of Stalin, and he got put on the naughty list and was basically outcast, and he lived in transit camps, which was more or less like a concentration camp in Russia for the last 4 years of his life. And they say this is one of the last poems he ever wrote. So imagining the situation he was in, for him to be able to come to this level of presence or consciousness and gather that up is part of what makes it so powerful, I think. So this is called And I Was Alive by Osip Mandelstam. And I was alive in the blizzard of the blossoming pear. Myself I stood in the storm of the bird cherry tree. It was all leaf life and star shower, unerring, self-shattering power. And it was all aimed at me. What is this dire delight, flowering, fleeing, always earth? What is being? What is truth? Blossoms rupture and rapture the air, all hover and hammer, time intensified and time intolerable, sweetness raveling rot. It is now. It is not.
Wow. You said that very beautifully.
And even at the very end, they're like, it is now, and it is all aimed at, the study of the four-cornered negation, untying the knot of consciousness is helpful as well sometimes.
Is that something that you have memorized and that you bring up in the situations, or was that a different poem?
Which part? The I Was Alive?
Yes.
So that was kind of the first poem I ever memorized. And that's a poem that, like I said, I kind of used to bring myself back into, I kind of recalibrate. It recalibrates kind of the very central rod of my being, so to speak.
So while you were actually reading that poem, I have to admit, I was like frantically Googling what you were saying to try and find the poem myself so I can read it and add something to add on top of it. But out, and I wasn't being present with actually what you were saying.
There we go. Man, we missed the opportunity. Yeah.
I did.
That's funny. Ironic? Not ironic. It'd be ironic if you weren't aware of it.
Yeah, the hindsight is an interesting, I don't know what it is, but it's interesting to always look back on it. I think a lot of people don't reflect back on their past life. And in some ways, I think everybody should have a therapist. I think a therapist is a glorified way to talk with yourself. It's just time where you can't be distracted, and they ask you questions that dig into your own psyche. And I get back to part of my vision, part of what I try and help people understand about me is really what helped me is meditation and journaling on a regular basis. Constant reflection that allowed me to reflect on my own past and history, my own traumas, those own feelings that, maybe I lash out on somebody, but then understanding that's connected to perhaps an incident with my dad earlier when I was younger in life. And yet we don't always understand those psychological traumas or those triggers. And that's why I think journaling is so important.
Yeah. And that's, that connects to something we've talked about before, which is this idea of what are those feedback loops? And it's one thing to discuss a feedback loop within an operation, within a business. It's another thing to discuss it within your personal life, and people will talk about hacks or apps or all these different tools. And there's whatever it is, you just got to have something that's telling you back whatever it is you're saying. And so for me, of course, back to this idea of poetry, that really is one of the mechanisms. There's a quote I have here from my mentor in poetry, this guy, Dan Beachy-Quick, a poet. He's a professor here in town. Best teacher I've ever had. And we've been working together the last couple of years. We'll meet once a month and we'll read through my work and I'll ask him my questions. My questions like, what is a poem? What is a poet? And when we first met, he said, it's a 10-year process. And he says it's 10 years for you to go from being inside of what you're writing to be on the outside of what you're writing. And the reason why you would meet up with somebody like myself, because I'm going to help you see your work from the outside. And in the interview, he was talking about this quote here. He says, I've long been of the awful suspicion that each of us has to create our own epistemology, that we must in the end explain to ourselves how we built our own minds, how we constructed our own hearts. And in this way, each of us is a philosopher. Of course, I love most that ancient confusion where what is poetic and what is philosophical aren't so easily told apart. And so the poem becomes the testing ground, or is it the threshing ground, for the mind's question it must ask itself. It means, or might mean, that the poem is a mind outside the mind, a heart outside the heart, offering back its questions. So for some poets, the work that they do is a way of reflecting and gaining more insight into their own perspective on the world. I agree. It's similar. It could be counseling. It could be charcoal, still life, whatever that may be. But for me, really, it's ultimately learning how to see the world as it really is, because I realize I have my ideas of what's going on out there, and it's completely separate from what might really be going on. So it's definitely a lifelong process.
And so for many people, including myself, I primarily try and understand myself and my views through simply reading nonfiction. And poetry is an added thing on top of that, where I think you can apply a life lesson, but in many ways it's like art, and that it can mean different things to different people. And for me, if I happen to read a poem, my instinct is to go on Google and be like, what does this poem mean? What is the definition? What can you extract out of it? Just trying to get somebody else's point of view. But in many ways, that's not even the point of poetry. I think really to reflect on it and try and understand the emotional triggers from what you're reading, how that connects to you, and to try and understand it yourself. So in some ways, as I understand it, you really can't have somebody else tell you what it means. What are your thoughts on that?
No, that is exactly it. That's a profound insight. It is exactly not the point to see what it quote unquote means. So I had asked my mentor today, and I asked him, what is the difference between prose and poetry? And his answer was simply that within prose, the epistemology, or how we know what it is we're meaning and how we know what it is about why we're using language the way we're using it, has already been established and agreed upon. That work is already done. All we're really doing is a transference of ideas. And sometimes it's a little more lyrical. Sometimes it's interesting. Sometimes it's dry. You'll find that in fiction, nonfiction. Whereas within poetry, the epistemological claim is wrapped up within the language of the poem itself. And so the poem itself contains the whole universe of itself. And you are then invited in to do a type of work that is not afforded within prose. And so people then will read a poem and be like, I have no idea what the poem means. And it's like, my experience of it has been like, and this isn't a great parallel, but the feeling has been like coming upon a dark forest and looking at the dark forest, which is the poem, and saying, that looks freaky. It's obscure to me and it's opaque and I can't enter in and I'm not going to enter in. That's a bad thing, or I'm having nothing to do with that. But I would say if you ever read a poem, and make sure you're reading good poems or great poems, don't waste time. There's so much friggin' poetry out there right now. It's insane. You want to find great poems.
Do you recommend people look for that?
I'd be happy to recommend a few starting points, but it kind of comes down to whatever you love. Like I said, only read really great poems that you love. But the other answer, I think, is simply just people in your own life. And that then becomes a sort of social experiment, because who really reads poetry, right? But I've had this thought, and I'm sure others have shared it as well, is that we were once an oral culture. And then when the printing press came along, we moved into a written culture. And that we somehow with the internet transitioned back into an oral culture. It's obviously different than the last time that we were an oral culture, but there are definitely some rich similarities that I think are worth mining. So one of them being that there's no longer this hierarchy of thought as there was 30 years ago with 3 news stations and mass media. There's no more mass media. It's been so decompartmentalized. There's a million different voices now. So we're kind of back at the stage of stitching together our reality together, rather than simply just receiving from some authoritative divine source, whether it's God or CBS. And there are still voices that are authoritative to us, So I think part of it is just simply challenging what that eclectic resource is and understanding that it needs to be positioned within more of a myriad, eclectic, robust dialogue with other traditions and perspectives. But that kind of then brings us back to poetry, which is understanding that it is this epistemological work. So it calls us into an awareness of how it is that we built the mind that we're using. It makes us more keen on our sources. So you Google something and you'll click any number of links. Do you really know the editor or the curator of that website and what they're all about and what their vibe is? Obviously, no.
Right.
But I guarantee you there's somebody in your life or a few people in your life that like poetry, and you're going to have a much richer engagement with it. So once again, it's not just a matter of getting or achieving, but it's this really process-oriented pursuit. So I would say the best way to find poems in the way that's going to be meaningful to you ultimately is going to be to ask people within your community if they read poetry, and if so, what they like, and then start a dialogue with them. Find that poem and read it. Read it 4 times. The first time, read it straight through and just listen to the music of the language. The second time, really pay attention to each line. Almost apply Leibniz's monadology. There's a monadology to a poem. So every line is its own poem. And then obviously each word, if you really want to dig into it, can become its own little poem. But read it in that kind of way and really apply that level of pressure. If it's a great poem, then there's going to be something to push on. And it really takes 3 or 4 readings until you kind of enter into the forest of the poem and then you're surrounded by it. And I guarantee you read a poem 3, 4, or 5 times and read it out loud, because most issues with meaning is simply that we're not hearing it and we forget that there's a music to it. So you have to read it out loud, and 3 or 4 readings in, and you're going to start to feel something forming or informing within you in terms of meaning. And I think that is the part of the gift of what poetry is. It's not that it's packaging up some esoteric meaning and this is the vehicle to get you this idea. It's really this process of how you engage with and understand language. And you look at any other art form, poetry is the only art form that you have to use the medium itself to discuss the thing. We don't talk about painting by painting at each other. We talk about it using language. And so with poetry, it is unique in that we have to use the essence of the medium itself to discuss it. And ultimately, if poetry isn't bringing people together in a meaningful dialogue, then I don't really know if it's worth it. So that's a long answer to a short question.
That is powerful stuff, because I think it's so easy to grow up and you read an article online and then you form your opinion based off of what this one editor at this large media news outlet who has biases and fallacies within that organization, and you just accept it and you create your own internal opinion without really digging into it. In poetry, it forces you to be conscious with your own internal feeling with yourself in many ways, since you can't just derive an opinion and a belief even from reading poetry. So you've actually taught me a new way of looking at it.
Good. Well, I look forward to hearing from you in a couple of months on how it's been.
Yeah. And on that note, I think it's a good time to end. Wondering if you have any last words, anything that you wish to leave our guests with, either about poetry or Kaizen or what have you.
No, I mean, in terms of Kaizen, it ultimately comes down to people, whether, lean, Kaizen, Scrum, Agile, any of those things. If you don't really love and respect humanity, then I don't know, don't waste your time with it. And then in terms of poetry, I think you're supposed to be frustrated. Poetry is supposed to move you into a place where you have an experience of not understanding. That is the natural experience of it. And it's doing exactly what it's meant to do. And all you have to do then is to spend a little more time with it and learn to cultivate a presence. It's what Keats calls negative capability. And, if you have show notes, you could put a link to negative capability in the show notes, because those will speak to it much more eloquently than I will. But it's the ability to be within the presence of binary and not have to reach after one or the other. And I think really what it teaches you then to do is to live in a non-binary, non-dualistic way. And I think that's profoundly important politically, socially, relationally. And I really think, poetry is one of the things that can help save the world. So I'll leave it with that.
Cheers to that. Thank you again, Seth. It's been amazing having you on the show.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. It's good.
And as a last note, all of the books, links, quotes, and poetry resources will be linked to in the show notes. Hey guys, this is Cody again. I hope you enjoyed that episode of MindHack, and if you're interested in getting more MindHack-worthy stuff straight to your inbox, then you might consider signing up for my weekly newsletter. It often contains links to new episodes, blog posts, and other interesting finds I found on the interweb in the past week. It pretty much focuses around productivity and efficiency. So if that's your thing, then be sure to visit my website at codymclain.com. That's MCLAIN.com to sign up. Also, if there are any interesting websites, companies, books, blog posts, quotes, or anything else that was mentioned in this episode, you can find it all and more by visiting the official website for the MindHack Show at mindhack.com. And as always, if you have any feedback, good or bad, I want to hear it. Send me a tweet, email, or what have you on either of my websites, as my goal with this show is to give you the maximum value in the shortest amount of time. That's all for now, guys. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you guys again soon.